You are like a sister to me, Marnie, the Duke of Penvarra said, laughing, and reached across the breakfast table to steal the last piece of toast from her plate as though he had done it 1,000 times, which he had. There is no woman in England I would sooner trust with my worst temper and my worst secrets. Now pour me the coffee before I perish. Alaric, 9th Duke of Penvarra, did not see the small stillness that came over Marguerite Vane's face at the word sister. He was reading a letter from his steward, and the morning light fell warm through the tall windows of the east parlour of Penvarra Court, and he was entirely, comfortably at ease, as a man is at ease only in the presence of someone he has stopped truly looking at. He held out his cup without lifting his eyes. She filled it. Her hand did not shake, though it might have been forgiven if it had. "You are welcome," she said, "for the toast and for the coffee and for the 29 years of my forbearance." 28, he corrected, still reading. "You were an infant when you came here and could hardly be said to be forbearing anything but a wet nurse. I have made up for it since." He looked up then and grinned at her, and for a moment the great brooding lines of his face, the firm jaw, the dark brows that had frightened half the county into obedience, softened into something boyish and unguarded, the face he wore for no one else in the world. "You have it that," he agreed. "You are the only creature at Penvarra who tells me the truth. My valet lies to spare my vanity. My steward lies to spare my purse. My mother lied on principle, God rest her. You alone are pitiless, and I love you for it." Marnie folded her napkin with great care. "Do finish your letter, Alaric." He did, and did not notice that she had risen and gone to the window, and stood there with her back to him a moment longer than the view required. Margaret Vane had come to Penvarra Court a fatherless, motherless infant of some indeterminate and inconvenient cousinship, a Vane on the distaff side, poor as a wren, connected by blood too thin to matter and too real to ignore. The old Duke, Alaric's father, had taken her in with the careless generosity of a man who does not feel the cost of a kindness, and she had been raised in the house half as a lady and half as an afterthought, given a governess and a good hand and a great many second-best gowns, and left, on the whole, to raise herself. She had done it well. She had grown into a quiet, clear-eyed, capable woman with a low laugh and a straight back, the sort of woman a household leans on without knowing it leans, the sort of woman whose absence, should she ever go, would be felt like the removal of a load-bearing wall, sudden, catastrophic, and far too late to remedy. Alaric had never once considered that she might go. He had grown up beside her. They had learned to ride in the same paddock, been beaten by the same tutors, hidden from the same thunderstorms under the same great oak on the south lawn. When his father died and the whole crushing weight of the dukedom came down on Alaric's 22-year-old shoulders, the estates, the tenants, the mines in the north, the debts his father had hidden behind his careless generosity. It had been Marnie who sat up with him through the black nights, Marnie who found the missing ledgers, Marnie who told him, when the lawyers had all gone home, that he was equal to it, that he had always been equal to it, that he need only stop being afraid. He had believed her because she never flattered. He had leaned on her because she never gave way. And somewhere in those years of leaning, he had ceased to see her as anything but the one fixed and faithful point in a shifting world. A sister, he called her, a friend, the good grey certainty at the centre of his life. He would as soon have looked at her as a man looks at a woman as he would have proposed marriage to the North Tower or courted the river. That was the shape of it, and he was 36 years old, and he thought the shape of it would never change. The letter from his steward concerned the autumn assembly at Harrogate, some 40 miles distant, the annual gathering of the northern gentry, 3 days of dinners and cards and dancing at the seat of the Earl of Marchwood. An event Alaric had attended every year of his adult life with particular resigned distaste of a man who is hunted by ambitious mothers and cannot show a limp. He tossed the letter across to Marnie. "Marchwood again," he said. "The usual carnival. Read it and tell me what I am obliged to endure." She read it, and something in her face changed, a lightening, a small private brightness he did not remark upon because he was busy buttering the toast he had stolen. "We are both invited," she said, "by name. The Countess writes that she hopes very much I will come this year. That is kind of her. Of course you are invited. You always are." He said it without thinking. She had gone with him every year in the character of what? He had never asked himself. A companion, a cousin. The one familiar face in a room of predators. She smoothed his evenings simply by being in them. When the assault of the marriageable daughters grew too fierce, he had only to cross the room to her and stand at her shoulder and be, for a moment, at rest. He had never wondered what those evenings cost her. He had never wondered, that is, until Harrogate, when he was made to learn it all at once and dearly. "I shall want a new gown, then," she said lightly, "if I am to be seen by name. Have 6, have a dozen. Ruin me." He rose, stretched, kissed the top of her head as he passed, an old habit, thoughtless as breathing, and went out to the stables to see about the new hunter, whistling, a man with no idea at all that the ground had begun, very quietly, to move beneath his feet. They set out for Harrogate on a bright hard morning in late September, the hedgerows gone to rust and gold, the sky the high pale blue of the turning year. Alaric rode alongside the carriage for the first hour out of restlessness, then, chilled, gave up his horse to a groom and climbed inside to sit across from her, stretching his long legs into the opposite corner and closing his eyes. "Wake me when we reach the toll," he said. "Or when you have something worth saying. Then you shall sleep the whole way, for you never think anything I say worth waking for. That is because you say it all whether I wake or not." He cracked one eye open. She was looking out of the window, her profile against the flying gold of the countryside, and it struck him, idly, the way one notices the weather, that she was looking uncommonly well this morning. The new travelling dress, a deep bottle green, suited her. Her dark hair was dressed more carefully than usual. There was colour in her cheeks and a kind of anticipation in the set of her shoulders that he could not remember seeing before. He was on the point of remarking that she looked in fine feather when a sudden, wholly uncharacteristic reluctance stopped his tongue, and he closed his eye again and said nothing, and did not know why he had not said it. The Earl of Marchwood's seat was a vast Palladian pile of pale stone set in a bowl of parkland, blazing with light by the time they arrived, carriages disgorging the whole of the northern quality onto the gravel sweep. Alaric hounded Mar down himself and felt, as he always did, the ripple of attention that his arrival caused, the turning heads, the mothers stiffening to the point like setters, the calculation running visibly behind a dozen powdered faces. The Duke of Penvarra, unmarried, rich as sin, dark as a thundercloud, and 36 years old with no hair and no fixed refusal on record. He was the great prize of 6 counties, and he loathed it. "Courage," Marnie murmured at his side, so low only he could hear. "The huntresses are in fine form tonight. There is Mrs. Ellersby by the door with 3 daughters and the look of a woman who has not eaten." He barked a laugh before he could stop it, and the tension went out of his shoulders, and he thought, as he always thought, and never once said, that he did not know how he had ever got through such evenings before Marnie was old enough to be brought to them. He offered her his arm out of habit. She took it out of habit. They went in together, and if a great many people noted the Duke of Penvarra arriving with the same handsome, self-possessed woman on his arm as he had arrived with these 7 years past, and drew from it the natural conclusion, Alaric noticed nothing of the sort. For it had never occurred to him that anyone could draw a conclusion at all. The first evening passed as such evenings passed. He danced twice, because to dance once was an insult and to dance 3 times was a proposal, and he chose his partners with the cold strategy of a general, the safely married, the safely old, the safely engaged elsewhere. He played whist and lost graciously and won gracelessly. He endured the Earl's port and the Earl's opinions on the corn laws and the Earl's youngest daughter, who had been coached to sit beside him at supper and had been given, poor child, nothing whatever to say. And through it all he was aware, at the edge of things, of Marnie moving easily through the rooms, talking with the dowagers, admired by the older men who found her restful, quietly running the evening's undercurrents as she ran everything, so that somehow his wine was always right and his exits always clear, and the whole grinding machine of the assembly turned a little more smoothly for her hand upon it. It was late, past midnight, the candles guttering low in their crystal, when he crossed the emptying ballroom to find her and go up, and stopped. She was not alone. A man stood with her by the great fireplace at the far end of the room, a tall, fair, easy-mannered man of perhaps 40, well-made and well-dressed, with a frank open face and the unmistakable weathered look of a soldier lately come home. He was saying something Alaric could not hear, and Marnie was laughing, really laughing, her head tipped back, the low warm laugh Alaric had always thought of, without ever quite framing the thought as belonging to him. The man's whole attention was fixed on her with a directness that was neither idle nor polite. And Marnie, laughing there in the candlelight in her deep green gown, with the firelight on her throat and a brightness in her face that Alaric had somehow never in 28 years put there himself, looked up at the stranger as though there were no one else in all the crowded house. Alaric stopped where he stood, 3 yards off, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for, a strange cold drop, a lurch, as of a stair that is not where the foot expects it. He stood quite still. He watched the fair man lay a hand, briefly and correctly, upon the back of a chair beside her, an old habit of gallantry, nothing in it, and he watched Marnie not move away, and the cold thing in his chest turned over once, heavily, and he did not understand it, and he did not like it at all. He crossed the last 3 yards before he had decided to. "Marnie," he said, and heard his own voice come out flatter and harder than he intended, the voice he used to close a conversation rather than open one. "The hour is late." She turned, and the brightness in her face did not dim so much as gather itself in, drawing back behind the calm, clear front she showed the world, and he noticed that too, noticed it with the same obscure displeasure, that she had a face for the fair man she did not have for him. "Alaric," she said, "may I present Colonel Edmund Hartley? Colonel Hartley, the Duke of Penvarra. The Colonel and I were speaking of Portugal. He was at Vimeiro and at Talavera, and knows the whole of that dreadful country I have only read about." The Colonel bowed, easily, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has stood in cannon smoke and does not find a duke particularly alarming. "Your Grace, I have heard a great deal of you." He had a pleasant, level voice and a steady grey eye, and Alaric disliked him instantly, comprehensively, and without the smallest justification, which he was gentleman enough to know even as he disliked him. "Have you?" said Alaric. "From whom?" "From half the county on the road up. A man cannot travel 20 miles in this part of the world without hearing of the Duke of Penvarra." He smiled. It was a good smile, frank and without flattery, and Marnie was watching it, and Alaric found he had set his teeth. "And from Miss Vane this last hour, who tells me you are the best landlord in the north and the worst whist player in England." "She flatters me on both counts," said Alaric. "I am the best whist player in England. I merely refuse to win from my host." "That is what all the worst players say," said Marnie, and the Colonel laughed, and Alaric had the sudden and wholly novel experience of hearing his oldest friend share a joke at his expense with a man he had known for 4 minutes, and finding that it did not amuse him in the least. He, who had spent 28 years being told the truth by Marnie Vane and laughing at it, he stood there and did not laugh, and could not have said why the same barb that delighted him at breakfast should sting so at midnight. "You are come for the assembly, Colonel?" he said, for something to say. "I am come to settle, your Grace. I have taken Hartsmere." He named a snug property some 8 miles from Penvarra Court, a good manor with good land that had stood empty 2 years. "I have sold out at last. The war is as good as won, and a man tires of soldiering, and I have a mind to grow old among my own fields while I still have the knees for it. I was born not 10 miles from here. I am coming home." He said it simply, and there was something in it, the plain contentment of a man who has done hard things and wants now only quiet ones, that would have won Alaric entirely, in any other man on any other night. "Then we shall be neighbours," Alaric said. "So Miss Vane has been kind enough to say," and the Colonel looked at her again, that same direct and undisguised look, the look of a man who has found something he means to have, and Marnie did not lower eyes, and Alaric felt the cold thing in his chest close its hand into a fist. "It grows very late," he said again. "Marnie, come." And she came. Of course she came, she always came, but she gave the Colonel her hand at parting, and the Colonel bowed over it and held it a heartbeat too long and said, "I hope I may call at Penvarra, Miss Vane, to continue our conversation. There is a great deal of Portugal I have not yet ruined for you." "You would be very welcome, Colonel," she said, and Alaric, standing at her shoulder, opened his mouth to say that the Duke of Penvarra was particular about his callers, and shut it again. because it would have been a lie and a small ugly one, and because Marnie would have known it for a lie, and because some lost shred of decency held him back from being, in that moment, the man he suddenly and horribly felt himself becoming. They went up the great staircase in silence. At the door of her chamber she paused, candle in hand, and looked at him with those clear, steady eyes he had known his whole life and never once, until tonight, felt himself examined by. "You were uncivil to him," she said, not sharply, merely as a fact, the way she told him all facts. "I was tired." "You are never uncivil when you are tired. You are only silent." She studied him a moment longer, and something crossed her face that he could not read, and that itself was a novelty, for he had always been able to read her, had prided himself on it. "My Marnie, whom I know like my own hand," something that might have been hope, and might have been sadness, and might have been the careful shuttering of both. "Good night, Alaric," she said, and went in and closed the door softly between them. He stood a long time in the dark passage after her candle had gone. He did not sleep well. He told himself it was the strange bed and the Earl's port, and did not believe it. He lay in the unfamiliar dark and saw, against the ceiling, the image of Marnie laughing up at the fair man with the firelight on her throat, and turned from it, and found it there again when he turned back. And by the grey hour before dawn he had worn a groove in his mind between two words he could not make lie easily together. Sister, he had always said, sister. And yet no man looks at his sister and wants to strike the smiling stranger who bows over her hand. He knew that much. He was not a fool, whatever else he was. But he pushed the knowledge away from him with both hands, because the alternative to being a fool was too large and too frightening and rearranged too much. And he was a man who had spent his whole life keeping the great house of himself in careful, load-bearing order, and this was a crack in a wall he had believed could not crack. By morning he had persuaded himself it was nothing, a poor night, a tedious neighbour. He came down to breakfast resolved to be his old easy self, and found Marnie already there, and Colonel Hartley with her. The two of them at the long table in the pale Marchwood breakfast room with the morning light on them, deep in some conversation that stopped, courteously, the instant he entered, stopped and left a silence behind it. The particular silence of two people who have been enjoying each other and are sorry to be interrupted. "Your Grace," said the Colonel, rising, "I trust you slept." "Admirably," Alaric lied. He took his coffee. He read his letters, or held them before his face and did not read them. And he listened. He could not help but listen to the two of them take up their conversation again. Low and easy, the Colonel telling some story of a mule that had carried the mess silver across the whole of Spain and refused to be shot at Badajoz, and Marnie laughing, and asking the sort of quick, sharp questions she asked, the questions that told the teller she was truly listening, that Alaric had received across 1,000 breakfasts and never once valued at their worth. He valued them now. He sat behind his letters and heard her give to this stranger the whole warm current of her attention. Her real attention, the thing itself, not the practised social surface, but the deep true article, and understood, with a slow and dreadful clarity, that he had been drinking from that spring every morning of his life and calling it water, and had never once thought to be grateful, and had certainly never thought that the spring might one day rise and flow another way. "Penvarra," said the Earl of Marchwood, arriving in a gust of self-importance and eggs. "You'll ride out with us to see the new coverts? Hartley, you'll come, you know the ground, you were bred here. Miss Vane, the Countess is asking for you. She's determined to have you and Mrs. Ashe go over the seating for the ball. She says you're the only two women in the North with any sense." "Of course," said Marnie, rising. And as she passed the Colonel's chair he said something low that Alaric did not catch, and she smiled, that smile, and was gone, and the Colonel watched her go, and then turned and found the Duke of Penvarra watching him watch her. And the two men looked at one another for a moment across the wreckage of the breakfast table with a perfect and wordless understanding of exactly what was passing between them. "She is a remarkable woman," the Colonel said evenly, neither apologizing nor pressing, simply laying the fact upon the table between them where they could both see it. "Miss Vane." "She is my cousin," said Alaric, "and under my protection," which was true, and which came out of his mouth with an edge of warning that he had no right whatever to put upon it. and which the colonel received with the unruffled steadiness of a man who has faced worse than a jealous duke over the breakfast china. "Then I am glad she has so careful a protector," said the colonel. "A woman of her quality deserves one. I only hope her protector wants her happiness above his convenience." And he rose and bowed and went out to the horses, leaving Alaric alone at the long table with the cooling coffee and the unread letters and a sentence lodged in him like a splinter under the nail, above his convenience, that he would not be able to leave alone for the rest of the day, or the rest of the week, though he did not yet know it. The rest of his life. He rode out to see the coverts. He was, by every account, poor company. He noticed the colonel's easy seat on a horse and resented it. He noticed the colonel's plain good sense about the land and resented that more. And when they came back muddy and cold in the early dark, and he went in search of Marnie and found her in the great drawing room with the Countess and Mrs. Ashe, and the seating charts spread out before them, found her flushed and quick and happy, in her element, arranging other people's evenings as she had arranged his whole life. He stood in the doorway unseen for a moment and looked at her, really looked at her, as he had not looked at her in 20 years, and he saw as though a film had been peeled from his eyes, not the good grey certainty at the centre of his life, not the sister, not the load-bearing wall, but a woman, a handsome, clever, warm-blooded, entirely marriageable woman of 28, with firelight in her dark hair and laughter in her mouth, whom another man had seen at a single glance for exactly what she was, while he, who had known her since before she could walk, had contrived to look straight through her for the better part of 3 decades. The knowledge went into him like cold water. He turned from the doorway before she saw him, and walked out into the frost-bitten garden without his coat, and stood there under the hard bright stars a long while, and said aloud to no one, in a voice that did not sound like his own, "Oh, God! Oh, you fool!" To understand how completely the Duke of Penvarra had failed to see the woman under his own roof, one had only to watch an ordinary day at Penvarra Court, in the years before Colonel Hartley came, and see how smoothly it ran and never once ask whose hand ran it. Alaric rose late and rode out early, an apparent contradiction he had never troubled to examine, for the truth was that his hot water was always steaming at his door, his boots always blacked, his horse always saddled, his letters always sorted into the urgent and the tiresome with the tiresome quietly answered in a fair copperplate hand that was not his own, and none of it ever crossed his mind, because it had always been so, and a man does not notice the ground he walks on until it gives way. He knew in some dim way that Marnie managed the household. He did not know what managing it meant. He did not know that she rose at 6 in winter in the dark, to see the fires laid and the kitchen started before the great sleeping bulk of the house and its master stirred. He did not know that she kept the accounts of 40 servants and 300 tenants in her head and on paper both, that she settled the disputes below stairs that would otherwise have come festering up to him, that she remembered the name of every gamekeeper's wife and every tenant's ailing mother, and sent the broth and the flannel, and the kind word that kept the whole vast machine of Penvarra loyal and content. He did not know that when he said carelessly at breakfast, "I shall have 12 to dinner Thursday, see to it," the seeing to it was a small campaign, the menus, the wines, the placement, the borrowed plate, the flowers, the 3 days' labour, and that it was always, always seen to flawlessly, so that he might sit at the head of his glittering table on Thursday, and be admired for his hospitality, and never once think of the woman at his left hand who had conjured the whole of it out of nothing and would clear it all away, invisibly, while he slept. She loved him too well to let him see the cost. That was the pity of it, and the heart of it. She had learned young that the surest way to be sent away from Penvarra was to be a burden, and the surest way to stay was to be indispensable and never seem to be. To carry everything and be seen to carry nothing, to smooth his path so perfectly that he might walk it his whole life believing it had always been smooth. It was love, all of it, every early rising and every sorted letter and every settled quarrel. It was 20 years of the most patient, self-effacing, wholly unthanked love a woman ever gave a man, and he took it as he took the air, and called her, when he thought of it at all, a good sort of girl, a capital manager, a sister, and never once suspected that he was being loved at all. let alone that he was being loved to the last full measure of a faithful heart. There had been, over the years, moments when he came near to seeing. There was the winter of the fever, when half the county lay sick and Marnie went from cottage with her baskets, until she took the fever herself, and lay 3 days between life and death in her small plain room at the top of the house. And Alaric had been frightened, genuinely frightened. More frightened than he understood, had sat outside her door in the cold passage half the night, unable to work or sleep or say why. And when the fever broke and the doctor came out and said she would live, Alaric had gone away into the stables and stood a while with his forehead against his horse's neck, shaking, and had told himself it was the strain of the sickness in the district, and had not asked himself why the sickness in the district had never made him shake before. He had bought her, when she was well, a fine grey mare, the best in the county, far too fine a gift for a poor cousin, and had been vaguely surprised at his own extravagance, and had watched her face when she saw the mare with a satisfaction out of all proportion to the giving of a horse, and had thought no more about it, because to think about it would have been to open the door he had nailed shut, and he was very practised at not opening that door. There was the matter of Sir John Ashe. Some 6 years past, a widowed baronet of the neighbourhood, a decent dull-worthy man, had taken a fancy to Marnie and made her an offer, a good offer, an honourable offer, a home and a name, and an end to her dependence, and had come to Alaric correctly to speak of it first. And Alaric had listened, and had felt, quite suddenly, a black and violent unwillingness that had astonished him with its force, and had heard himself say coldly that Miss Van's affairs were her own, but that he thought it only fair to say that Sir John and she would not suit, that she was accustomed to a certain manner of life, that she was, in short, needed at Penvarra, and Sir John, taking the hint a duke's coldness gives, had withdrawn his suit and married elsewhere within the year. And Alaric had told himself he had done Marnie a service, saved her from a dull-worthy bore, and had been so relieved when the whole thing blew over, so lightened, so restored to his comfortable order, that he had never once stopped to ask himself by what right he had answered for her at all, or why the thought of her going to Sir John Ashe had made him, for one ugly moment, want to knock a good man down. He had told her nothing of the offer. She had learned of it, years later, by accident, and had looked at him across the breakfast table with an expression he could not read, and had said only quietly so, "I see." And he had not understood, and had gone back to his letters, and the door had stayed shut. He saw all of this now, of course, in the strange, clear, terrible weeks after Marchwood. Saw the fever and the grey mare and Sir John Ashe and 100 other small betraying moments, laid out in a row like evidence at his own trial, each one a place where his heart had spoken plainly and his mind had refused to hear it. He had loved her all along. The proof was everywhere, in 20 years of his own conduct, if only he had had the courage to read it. He had merely called it by every name in the world except its own. And the man who came at last to read the evidence rightly was not the careless boy who had accumulated it, but a chastened and clear-eyed man who had been shown, in a single evening's firelight, the whole shape of his own long blindness, and who could never again, as long as he lived, unsee it. He did not sleep that night either. He lay awake and did the thing he had spent his whole life not doing. He examined himself, mercilessly, the way Marnie had taught him to examine a ledger, not for the answer he wanted, but for the truth. And the truth, when he made himself look at it, was not the sudden thing he had taken it for. It was not the colonel who had made him love her. The colonel had merely lit a lamp in a room Alaric had been living blind for years. He went back through his life by the light of it and saw the whole of it made strange and clear. He saw that it was Marnie's face he looked for first in every room he entered, that it was Marnie's opinion he wanted before he trusted his own, that the best hours of his days were the quiet ones with her, the estate work, the long rides, the evenings by the fire when the house was still and she read to him or argued with him or simply sat, mending something in the lamplight. And he was happy, plainly and completely happy. In a way he was happy nowhere else on earth, and had never thought to wonder at. He saw the times he had refused a match, 6 eligible, unexceptionable matches over the years, and told himself and everyone else it was because the ladies were foolish or grasping or cold, and saw now, with a hot flush of shame in the dark, that they had been none of them so foolish or grasping or cold as all that, and that the true reason no woman had ever suited him was that he had already, without knowing it, given the whole of his heart into the keeping of the one woman he had trained himself never to see. He had called her sister to keep her safe. That was the ugliest part, the part he circled longest before he could make himself take hold of it. He had called her sister because to call her anything else would have obliged him to do something about her, to court her, or send her away, or in some fashion resolve the thing, and a man of 22 crushed under a dead father's debts had had no strength to spare for resolving anything. And so he had reached for the safest word in the language and laid it over her like a dust sheet over furniture he could not afford to think about, and had left it there so long that he had forgotten, himself, what lay beneath. Sister. He had said it to her that very morning over the toast, laughing. You are like a sister to me. And she had gone to the window and stood with her back to him a moment too long, and he had not seen. God forgive him, he had not seen. Did she? He got no further than that thought the first time it came, before it frightened him so badly he had to get up and go to the window and stand a while breathing. Did she care for him? Had she all these years? Was it possible that Marnie, his Marnie, clear-eyed, pitiless, truth-telling Marnie, had cared for him in the way he now monstrously and belatedly understood that he cared for her, and had hidden it and borne it, and gone on pouring his coffee and mending his shirts and steering him gent towards other women's daughters, and calling him Alaric across the breakfast table with never a tremor in her voice. The thought was so large and so terrible, and so shot through with a wild, painful hope that he could not hold it steady. He remembered 100 small things. The way she had gone very still, once years ago, when he had come home betrothed for a fortnight to a Miss Carew, and how the betrothal had quietly foundered, and how it had been Marnie, oddly, who found the flaw in Miss Carew's settlements that gave him his honourable escape. The way she never, ever spoke of marrying herself, laughed it off, said she was wedded to Penvarra and its ledgers, and how he had taken this at face value, relieved, glad, and never once asked her whether it was what she wished. The way she looked at him sometimes in unguarded moments quickly, and then away. Or was he a vain fool, a jealous fool, inventing her heart to match his own now that it suited him, a rich Duke of 36 who had woken up one morning wanting the thing he had always had, and had persuaded himself she wanted it too because it flattered him to think so. That was possible. That was, he told himself grimly, all too possible. The Colonel wanted her, plainly and honourably. The Colonel could offer her a good name, a good house, a whole heart freely given, a life of her own at last after a lifetime of being someone's afterthought. And what could Alaric offer? 30 years of having overlooked her, a word, sister, that he would now have to unsay, and the very great likelihood that if he spoke and she refused him, he would lose not only the hope of her, but the fact of her, the friendship, the daily bread of her presence, the one true thing in his life. To speak was to risk everything. To be silent was to watch the Colonel take her by inches, week by week, call by call, and to keep his own counsel and his own dignity and lose her anyway, only slower. He was still standing at the window when the sky went grey, and he had resolved nothing, except that he would not lose her without a fight, and that he did not the least idea in the world how to fight for her, having spent his whole life in the comfortable certainty that she could never be lost. They returned to Penvarra Court 2 days later. The parting at Marchwood was the worst hour of the visit. The Colonel handed Marnie into the carriage himself, before Alaric could reach her, and said, I shall call within the week, Miss Vane, if I may. Hartsmere is but 8 miles from Penvarra. A morning's ride, and a pleasant one. And Marnie said he might, and the Colonel bowed and stepped back, and looked up once at the carriage window as they pulled away, and Alaric, sitting opposite her, watched her watch the fair man dwindle on the gravel sweep, and said nothing. All the long cold way home. He did not know how to begin. That was the plain fact of it, and it would have astonished the 6 counties who feared him to learn it. The Duke of Penvarra, who had faced down a mob at the mine gates and a chancery suit and a duel in his youth without his pulse rising, did not know how to tell a woman he had loved her for 20 years without knowing it. He who had never in his life courted anything, women had always come to him, thrown at him, and he had only to stand still and refuse, had no idea how a man went about winning a woman who already knew his every fault, who had seen him childish and drunk and afraid, who could not be dazzled by his title, because she ran the household that title paid for, and who had every reason on earth to believe, because he had told her so at breakfast not a week before, that he thought of her as a sister and nothing more. He began badly. He began, in fact, disastrously, because he was a proud and clumsy man attempting the most delicate operation of his life with no instrument but his own bare hands. The first morning home, he came down to breakfast and, casting about for some way to be different, to signal to her the vast change that had come over him, said abruptly, "You have done something to your hair." She had not. She looked at him warily. "I have done nothing to my hair, Alaric." "It suits you," he said, "however you have done it. I have done nothing to it." She poured his coffee, watching him now with open suspicion, as she might watch a horse that had begun to fidget for no reason. "Are you unwell?" "I am perfectly well." "Cannot a man remark upon a lady's?" He floundered, colouring, a great dark, powerful man of 36, going red as a schoolboy over the marmalade. "You look well. That is all. You have looked well of late." "I look precisely as I have looked for 28 years," said Marnie, "and you have never remarked upon it once in the whole of that time. So I confess I find it unsettling that you should begin now. Have you lost a wager? Is this a forfeit? No. Have you done something you must confess and are attempting to soften me first? No, Marnie, because if you have overspent on that hunter, you had far better tell me plainly and let me find the money than compliment my hair, which does neither of us any credit." And he gave it up, defeated, retreating behind his newspaper with his ears burning, and heard her go about her morning with a small puzzled frown he could feel through the paper, and knew he had made a botch of it, and had not the faintest idea how to make a better. He tried other ways. He gave her flowers, cut himself from the succession houses, and presented them with such a wooden and unaccustomed formality that she asked him gently whether someone had died. He proposed a ride, and then, alone with her on the high moor with the whole speech he had prepared burning a hole in him, found he could not begin it, and talked instead, for an hour, with mounting despair about drainage. He caught himself watching her across rooms, and looking away when she turned and flushing when she caught him, until she began, quite reasonably, to think there was something the matter with him, and to treat him with the careful, watchful, slightly alarmed kindness of a woman nursing a man through an illness he will not name. And all the while the days were passing, and the week was passing, and at the end of it, precisely as he had promised, Colonel Edmund Hartley came riding up the long avenue of Penvarra Court on a good grey horse, with the frank open look of a man who knows exactly what he is about, to call upon Miss Vane. The Colonel meanwhile did not press his advantage, but neither did he withdraw, and Alaric was made to watch, through the whole of that long autumn, a master-class in the courtship of a woman by a man who understood her, which was of itself a species of torture more refined than anything the Earl of Marchwood's port could inflict. Edmund Hartley called at Penvarra Court, correctly, once a week. He never overstayed, he never flattered. He brought Marnie no hothouse flowers and no ribbons and no verses. He had taken her measure in a single evening and knew such things would only make her wary, but he brought her instead the things a soldier's life had taught him a clever woman would value, a curious dried flower pressed in a book, from a Spanish hillside where a battle had been, a map he had drawn himself of a river crossing that she had asked to see, a plain true account, when she pressed him, of what the war had actually been, the mud and the fear and the small daily courage of ordinary men, told without heroics and without self-pity, in a way that made her lean forward and forget the tea going cold. He treated her, in short, as an equal and an intelligence and a woman all at once, which was precisely the trinity that no one at Penvarra, least of all its Duke, had ever offered her together. And Alaric, forced by his own jealousy to attend to every call, saw exactly what the Colonel was doing and saw exactly why it answered, and hated it, and could not fault it, and learned from it more than he would ever admit. For the Colonel was teaching him, all unknowing, how a woman like Marnie was to be won, and the first lesson was that she was not to be won at all, in the sense of taken. She was to be courted in the old exact meaning of the word, made court to, attended upon, deferred to, given room. The Colonel never once presumed. He asked where Alaric would have assumed. He listened, where Alaric would have talked. He wanted, plainly and without shame, but he wanted her happiness first and his own second, and he showed it in 100 small deferences, and Marnie unfolded under it like a plant too long kept in the shade brought out at last into a gentle sun. Alaric watched her unfold, and understood that she had never once unfolded so for him, and that it was his own fault, and that the colonel was giving her, freely and at once, the whole of what Alaric had withheld for 20 years, and the jealousy in him was so black some evenings that he had to leave the room. But it was not only jealousy, and this too he came slowly to understand, and it was the beginning of his salvation, for underneath the jealousy, if he was honest, and he was learning painfully to be honest, there was a thing that looked almost like gratitude. The colonel was making Marnie happy. Alaric could see it. The colour in her face, the quickness in her step, the way she began to sing again, about the house low, half to herself, as she had not sung in years. She was happy, and some small, stubborn, decent part of Alaric, buried under the jealousy but not extinguished by it, was glad of her happiness, glad in a way that surprised and shamed and instructed him, even if it should be another man who gave it, because he loved her, truly loved her, and love, he was discovering, is the thing that wants the beloved's happiness even at the cost of one's own, and any wanting that will not pay that cost is not love at all, but only a finer sort of greed. He tested himself against this again and again through that autumn, lying awake. If he could not have her, if she chose the colonel, could he be glad for her? And the answer, when he had wrestled it down to the truth, was yes, a bleeding, reluctant, wholehearted yes. And the day he could say that yes and mean it was the day he first believed he might, some day, be worthy of her, for he had loved her at last more than he loved himself, which he had never in his life done for any living soul, and it changed him at the root. He made his clumsy attempts alongside all this, of course, and they went on being clumsy, and Marnie went on being baffled by them. There was the day he tried to give her a jewel. He had gone up to his mother's rooms, unopened these 14 years, and found the old Duchess's jewel cases, and chosen a thing, a small pendant of pearls and green stones, an old thing, a good thing, and had come down meaning to give it to Marnie and say what it meant, that it was his mother's, that it was for the mistress of Penvarra, that he wanted her to be that mistress, and had lost his nerve entirely at the sight of her going over the linen accounts with her spectacles on the end of her nose, and had thrust the little case at her and said gruffly, "Here, this is yours." My mother would have wished it and fled, and Marnie had opened it and looked at the pendant a long time, and then had come and found him and said gently, and with a terrible kindness that was worse than anger, "Alaric, this was your mother's. It is a thing for a wife. You cannot go giving your mother's jewels to your cousin, because you are in some fit of remorse about the colonel. Take it back. When you have a wife, give it to her and let it mean what it was meant to mean." And she had put the little case back into his hand and closed his fingers over it, and gone back to her linen, and Alaric had stood in the passage with his mother's pendant in his fist and understood that she had given him back his heart, wrapped in green and pearl, and told him she would not take it out of pity or remorse, and that if he wanted her to have it he would have to convince her that it meant what it ought to mean, and that he was very far indeed from having done so. It was a rebuff. It was also, he understood later, the first small proof she gave him that she wanted the pendant to mean the true thing, for a woman who did not care would simply have thanked him and kept it, and he carried that scrap of hope away with him, and it lasted him a month. And there was the terrible evening of the poem, emboldened by some devil, having read that great lovers wrote verses, Alaric, who had not composed a line of poetry since he was flogged over Ovid at 14, sat up half a night and wrote Marnie a poem, and it was a very bad poem, and he knew it was a bad poem even as he wrote it, and he wrote it anyway, and left it at her place at breakfast, and then could not stay in the room to see her find it, and took his coffee to the library and sat there in an agony of self-consciousness listening for any sound, and there was no sound. And at length he crept back, and found her at the table with the poem in her hand, and her face turned away and her shoulders shaking, and thought for one plunging moment that she was weeping over it, that he had reached her at last, and then she turned, and he saw that she was laughing, helplessly, tears of pure laughter running down her face, and she held up the wretched paper and gasped, "Alaric, Thy eyes like twin dark pools of Penvarra's trout stream gleam. Oh, oh, I cannot, the trout stream, and she was off again, and he stood there scarlet to the ears, mortified beyond speech, and then, quite suddenly, because her laughter was the warmest and dearest sound in the world and he had made it, he began to laugh too, at himself, at the trout stream, at the whole absurd spectacle of the feared Duke of Penvarra reduced to rhyming his cousin's eyes with a fish, and the two of them laughed together until they were weak, the way they had laughed as children, and for a moment, one bright unguarded moment, the 4 months of stiffness and grief and doubt fell clean away, and they were simply Alaric and Marnie again, who had always been able to make each other laugh, and she looked at him across the ruin of the poem with her face wet and open and unguarded, and he looked at her, and the laughter died in both their throats at once, and something else came into the room and stood between them, trembling unspoken, and she was the one who looked away, but she kept the poem. He found it years later, pressed in the back of her book of hidden verses, the trout stream and all, folded small, worn soft with handling, and he never let her know he had found it, and it undid him every time he thought of it for the rest of his life. The days at Penvarra took on, that autumn, a peculiar and painful rhythm, ordered around the colonel's weekly calls the way a fever is ordered around its returning chills. Alaric came to dread the Wednesdays and to live for the space between them. On the Wednesday he would find some pretext to be near, and would sit in his corner like a thundercloud, and would watch and would suffer. And on the Thursday he would begin, all over again, the slow secret labor of remaking himself, so that by the following Wednesday he might be, in some small measurable degree, more nearly the man who deserved her. And the strange thing, the thing he could never have foreseen, was that the labor began, little by little, to be its own reward, that in learning to see Marnie he learned to see everyone, and in learning to want her happiness above his own convenience he learned to want the happiness of others too, and the black brooding Duke whom 6 counties feared began, without meaning to become something the 6 counties had never seen and did not know what to make of, a kind man. His tenants noticed it first, for they were nearest the ground. The Duke, who had always been just but cold, a fair landlord and a distant one, began to come among them differently. He remembered names now, had made himself remember them, having been shown by his own long thoughtlessness what it was to be a name someone could not trouble to learn. He sat in the widow Cray's cottage a whole afternoon and heard out her grievance about the boundary hedge, which the old Alaric would have settled in a cold sentence from horseback, and settled it in her favour, and stayed to admire her grandson's whittling, and went away leaving her staring after him as at a changeling. He found the money to mend the school roof that had been leaking 3 winters. He walked the poorest of his farms himself in the wet, and saw what he had never let himself see, and did not like it, and began, quietly and at his own cost, to put it right. And when the talk of it came back to Penvarra, as such talk does, and reached Marnie, she said nothing. But Alaric caught her once looking at him across the hall with a strange arrested expression, as though she were seeing something she had long believed impossible and did not quite dare to trust. And he knew, though she never said it, that of all the things he had done to prove himself, this was the one that reached her deepest, not the flowers, not the pendant, not the wretched poem, but the plain slow evidence that his heart, once opened, had opened not to her alone but to the whole world she had always loved and served. And that the change in him was not a courtship but a conversion. The colonel saw it too, and being a generous man said so. On one of his Wednesday calls, finding Alaric alone in the hall for a moment while Marnie was fetched, he remarked, quietly, "The country speaks very well of you these days, your grace. Better than when I came." And Alaric stiff had said something short, and the colonel had looked at him with his steady grey soldier's eye and added, not unkindly, "I have watched a good many men under fire. It is where you learn what a man is made of, not the ones who never feel the fear. There are precious few of those and mostly fools, but the ones who feel it and go forward anyway. You are going forward, I think. It is not my business, but I have come to like you, Penvarra, which is inconvenient of me, and I will say only this. Whatever she decides, you are the better man for the deciding of it, and that is worth something, whichever way it falls." And he had turned away to greet Marnie coming down the stair, leaving Alaric to reflect that he was being schooled in magnanimity by the very man he most wished to hate, and could not, and that this too was somehow part of the education he had needed and never had. There was a day the three of them rode out together, at the colonel's suggestion and Marnie's insistence, for she would not, she said, be fought over like a bone between two dogs, and if the two men could not be civil in company, then they were neither of them worth her trouble. So they rode, the three of them, out over the high moor in the thin gold October light, and it was against all expectation one of the best days of that whole strange autumn, for with Marnie between them, quick and bright and holding them both to their best behaviour, the two men found they could talk of horses, of land, of the war, of the management of a place like Hertsmere, which the colonel was learning and Alaric knew to his bones, and Alaric found himself, against his will, giving the colonel good advice about his drainage and his fences, freely, because the man had asked and because it was churlish not to, and the colonel took it gratefully, and gave Alaric in a soldier's frank account of leadership under strain that Alaric, thinking of his tenants and his mines, filed away and never forgot. And Marnie rode between them on the grey mare Alaric had given her the year of the fever, watching the two of them slowly, grudgingly, come to respect each other, and her face, when Alaric caught it, was full of a complicated feeling he could not name, a kind of wondering hope, and under it a kind of grief, as of a woman watching two doors she cannot choose between, knowing that whichever she opens, she must close the other forever. At the top of the moor they had stopped to breathe the horses, and looked out over the whole spread of the country, Penvarra's grey towers in the fold of the valley and Hertsmere's chimneys smoking 8 miles off, and the colonel had said half to himself, a man could be happy here. I had forgotten how much I missed it, all those years in the mud, and Marnie had said softly that she thought there was no country in the world to match it, and the two of them had shared a look, an easy neighbourly look, two people who loved the same green land, and Alaric, watching them, had felt the jealousy rise and then, with an effort that cost him more than the whole ride, had put it down. For it was true. The colonel could make her happy here. The colonel was a good man who loved this country and loved her, and would give her a good life 8 miles from the home she knew. And there was a version of the future, plain and decent and near, in which Marnie Vane became Marnie Hartley and grew old happy at Hertsmere, and Alaric stood godfather to her children and dined with her every month for 40 years and was glad, genuinely glad, to see her cherished at last, even by another man, even at the cost of his own heart's ruin. He made himself look at that future squarely, there on the high moor with the wind in his face, and made himself say, inwardly, if that is what will make her happy, then let it be that, and God keep them both. And he found that he could say it, not easily, not without a wound that would never quite close, but he could say it and mean it, and the saying of it, he understood afterward, was the exact moment his love finally came of age, for it had stopped, at last, being about what he wanted, and become entirely about what she deserved, which is the only love that is worth a woman like Marnie, and the only love, as it happened, that could ever have won her. They rode down off the moor in the failing light, the three of them, and parted at the crossroads, the colonel to Hertsmere and the two of them to Penvarra, and Marnie was very quiet the whole way home, and Alaric did not intrude upon the quiet, and when they came into the lit hall and she gave him her hand to dismount, she held his a moment longer than she needed to, and looked at him, and seemed on the point of saying something, and did not, and went up, and Alaric stood in the hall a long while after, turning his hand over, where the warmth of hers still lingered, and daring, for the first time since Marchwood, to hope in good earnest. Alaric saw him from the library window and stood, the ledger sliding off his knee to the floor unheeded. He had half a mind to send word that Miss Vane was not at home. He had, indeed, taken 2 steps towards the bell before he stopped himself, appalled at what he had nearly done. For it would have been a lie, and a mean one, and worse, it would have been to treat Marnie as a thing, a possession to be locked away, rather than a woman with a will and a heart of her own. And if there was one certainty in all his new confusion, it was that Marnie Vane belonged to no one and never had, and that any man who tried to keep her against her wish would deserve to lose her, and would. So he did not ring the bell. He stood at the window and watched the groom take the grey, and watched the colonel go up the steps of the house that was Alaric's house, to see the woman Alaric loved, and he did nothing at all, and it was the hardest thing he had ever made himself do. He meant to keep away. He lasted an hour. Then, on the transparent pretext of a book, he went into the morning room where he knew they were sitting, and found them at the window with the autumn light on them and the tea things between them, easy together, mid-laughter, and the sight of it went through him like a blade. "Penvarra," said the colonel, rising with that maddening, unhurried courtesy. "Miss Vane and I were speaking of the peninsula again. She has a better grasp of the campaign than most of the generals who fought it. She has a better grasp of most things than most people," said Alaric. And it came out too warm, too proprietary, and he saw Marnie glance at him surprised, and he could not look at her, and took himself to the far side of the room with his book and did not read a word of it, sitting there like a great dark cloud in the corner of their sunshine. Unable to leave and unable to join, he heard the whole of the call. He heard the colonel ask her at the last whether she rode, and whether she would ride out with him one morning to see Hertsmere, which he was setting to rights, and whether her cousin the Duke might spare her. And he heard Marnie hesitate, heard it, the small pause, and glance again towards him, and something in that glance, some question in it, some appeal made Alaric look up at last. And he saw in her face for one bare unguarded instant, before she governed it, a thing that turned his whole world over. He saw that she did not want to say yes to Colonel. He saw that she was waiting, that she had been waiting, perhaps the whole hour, the whole week, the whole miserable botched fortnight, for Alaric to give her some reason not to. And that if he sat there in his corner like a sulking child and gave her nothing, she would say yes to the colonel, and be right to, and it would be his owing entirely. He rose. He crossed the room. His heart was going like a hammer, and he had no speech ready, and he did the only thing left to a man who has run out of cleverness, which is to tell the truth. "Colonel Hartley," he said, "you must forgive me. I find I cannot spare her." The colonel's brows went up a fraction. Marnie went very still. "Not his." Alaric drew a breath. "You will think me an ill-bred fellow, and perhaps I am, but I would rather be thought ill-bred than be a coward, and I have been a coward for 20 years, and I am done with it. Ma must speak with you, now, if you will." "Colonel, I beg you will excuse us, and I beg your pardon, more than I can decently say, for I like you, which makes it worse." There was a silence. The colonel looked from the Duke to Marnie and back, and something moved behind his steady grey eyes, not surprise, Alaric thought. The colonel had seen this coming from the first night at Marchwood, had seen it before Alaric had, and then a slow, wry, entirely gallant acceptance, the good grace of a soldier who knows a lost field when he stands on one. "I think," said the colonel, setting down his cup and rising, "that I have chosen a poor morning for my call." He bowed to Marnie low over her hand, and this time he did not hold it, but released it at once as a man relinquishes what was never his. "Miss Vane, it has been the greatest pleasure of my homecoming to have known you, however briefly. I hope you will allow me to say, as one soldier says it of a well-fought thing, that whatever comes of this morning, the man who wins you will be the most fortunate fellow in England, and had better know it." He turned to Alaric. "Your Grace, I'll see myself to my horse," and at the door he paused and looked back and said mildly to Alaric, "I told you at Marchwood I hoped her protector wanted her happiness above his convenience. I am glad to have been of some small use in the discovery." And he was gone, and they heard, a minute later, the grey horse go off down the avenue at a good honest trot, carrying away the best rival Alaric would ever have and the truest gentleman, and neither of them ever forgot him. And then Alaric was alone with Marnie in the morning room with the autumn light going gold across the floor between them, and all his life had come down to this, and he found that his voice, when it came, was not steady at all. "Marnie," he said, "I have been the greatest fool that ever drew breath." She had risen when the colonel left, and stood now with one hand on the back of the chair, very straight, very pale, her clear eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not read, guarded, braced, as though she stood behind a door and held it shut with all her weight. "Sit down, Alaric," she said, and her voice was careful and cool, and it frightened him. "You have driven away a good man who came here with honourable intentions in my cousin's house, which is my home, and you have done it in a fit of, I do not know what, temper, whim. And you will tell me what possessed you, And then you will write to Colonel Hartley and apologize, 'cause he deserved better of this house than that." "I cannot apologize," said Alaric, "for I am not sorry. I am the sorriest man in England for a great many things, but not for that." He came a step closer. She did not move, but her hand tightened on the chair. "Marnie, listen to me. I know I have no right. I know what I said to you. Over the toast, not a fortnight past. I called you my sister. I have called you my sister for 20 years. His voice broke on it. "And it was a lie, Marnie. It was the greatest and the most cowardly lie of my life. And the worst of it is that I told it to myself first, so completely that I believed it. Until I saw you laughing in the firelight at Marchwood with another man's eyes upon you. And the whole false floor of it gave way beneath me. And I understood all at once, too late, like a man waking in a burning house, that I have loved you the whole of my life, not as a sister, not as a friend. As a man loves the one woman in the world he cannot do without. I have loved you every day for years and called it something else because I was too great a coward to call it by its name, and I have let you pour my coffee and mend my shirts and steer me towards other women, and I have let you go on being overlooked in your own home by the one man who should have. He could not finish it. He stood before her, this great feared brooding man, undone, his hands open at his sides, and looked at her and waited, and it was the most naked and defenceless he had ever been in his life. And Marnie Vane, who had schooled her face for 28 years, who had learned before she could read to want nothing she could not have, and to show nothing she could not afford to lose, Marnie stood behind her chair with her knuckles white upon it, and did not fall into his arms, did not weep, did not soften. She looked at him a long moment with those clear eyes gone suddenly bright, too bright, and when she spoke her voice was low and level and terrible. "How dare you?" she said. The words fell into the golden room like stones into still water. "How dare you?" she said again, and now the level voice was shaking, and he saw with horror that she was not cold at all, that the coolness had been a dam, and the dam was going. "How dare you stand there and say it now, when it costs you nothing? When there is a man 8 miles away who offered me a whole life, his name, his house, his heart freely, without my having to earn it or hide it or wait 20 years for it, and you drive him from the door, and then you turn to me and say you have loved me all along. Do you know what those words are worth to me, Alaric? Do you know what I would have given for them? I will tell you what they are worth to me now. Nothing. They are worth nothing, because you did not spend them. You hoarded them for 20 years while I withered on them, and now that another man has shown you my worth, now that someone else wants me and you find you cannot bear to lose your comfortable convenience, now you fling them at me as though they were a gift. Marnie, be quiet. You have talked for 20 years. You can be quiet for 2 minutes. She was crying now, though she did not seem to know it, the tears standing on her lashes and falling and being ignored, her voice rising over them clear and furious and broken. Do you imagine I did not know? Do you imagine any of this is news to me? I have loved you since I was 15 years old, Alaric Penvarra. Since the summer your father died and you sat up all night in that library white as a ghost, sure you would fail, sure you would lose everything, and I sat with you, and I thought, this is the man, there will never be another. God help me, this is the one. I was 15 and I knew it the way you know your own name, and I have loved you every single day since, through every eligible Miss Carew and Miss whoever you paraded through this house, through every morning you took my coffee without looking at me, through every single time you called me sister. And I smiled, and I poured the coffee, and I found the floor in Miss Carew's settlements, and I said nothing because I had nothing, no name, no fortune, no claim on you but your father's charity and your own careless. A poor cousin does not tell a duke she loves him, Alaric. A poor cousin who is taken in out of pity learns very young to want nothing, to show nothing, to make herself so useful and so quiet that she is never sent away. That is what I did. I made myself indispensable so that I need never leave you, and I told myself that half a loaf, that a whole life at your side as your sister, your friend, your steward in a skirt, I told myself that was enough, and it was not enough. It was never for one single day enough. But it was what I could have, and I took it. And I was almost content, God forgive me. I had almost made my peace with it, until Edmund Hartley looked at me across a ballroom as though I were a woman and not a fixture, and I remembered, all at once, what it was to be wanted. And I could not. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and when she went on it was in a whisper, and it was the whisper that broke him, not the shout. And you want me to believe you have loved me all along, when for 20 years you looked straight through me. When it took another man's arm to make you see me, how am I to believe that it is me you love, Alaric, and not the losing of me? How am I to trust the heart of a man who did not know his own until someone tried to take from him a thing he never valued while he had it? Tell me that, 'cause I cannot. I have wanted this too long and too hard to be given it now out of jealousy and habit and affright. I would rather have Edmund Hartley, who wanted me for myself at first sight and asked for nothing but the chance to make me happy, than have you turned to me at last only because you could not endure to see me go. Her voice failed entirely. It would break me, Alaric. Do you understand? To take it and be wrong would break me past mending, and I have kept myself whole this long. I will not gamble the last of me on a jealous man's whim. She turned blindly and went out of the room, and this time when the door closed between them it was not soft. Alaric stood alone in the golden light for a long time. He did not go after her. Every instinct in him, the ducal instinct, the instinct of a man accustomed to having, to reaching out his hand and closing it, screamed at him to go after her, to seize her, to make her hear him, to overwhelm her doubt with the sheer force of his want. And he did not, because for the first time in his life he understood that his want was not the point, had never been the point, and that a man who had spent 20 years taking her for granted could not put it right in an afternoon by taking her again, more forcefully, now against her will. She had said the truest and most dreadful thing that could be said to him, and he had no answer to it, because it was just, every word of it was just. How was she to believe him? He had given her, in 20 years, nothing but proof that he did not love her, and now he asked her to disbelieve 20 years' proof on the strength of a single afternoon's speech. He would not have believed it himself. She was right not to believe it, and the knowledge that she was right, and that his belated love might have come too late, not because she did not love him, but precisely because she loved him too much to survive being wrong about it. That was a punishment more exact than any he could have devised for himself, and he took it standing, and did not flinch from it. And something in him that had been a boy for 36 years finished, at last, becoming a man. He wrote to Colonel Hartley that night. He sat down at the library desk where his father had died and where Marnie had sat up with him through the worst night of his life, and he wrote, in his own hand, to the rival he had turned from his door, a letter he never showed to a living soul, and that the colonel kept, folded in his campaign desk until the day he himself died an old and happy man, married these 30 years to another good woman entirely. Alaric never repeated a word of what he wrote. But the colonel, in his old age, said once to a friend that it was the letter of a gentleman, and that it had ended with the sentence, "You saw in a night what I was blind to for 20 years, and I owe you the whole of my future, if I am man enough to earn it, and I do not know that I am." And the colonel, telling it, had said, "I wrote back that any man humble enough to write such a letter was man enough to earn her, and that he had better be quick about it, and that I should dance at the wedding. And I did, but that was later." That night Alaric sealed his letter and sat on alone in the dark library and did not sleep, and understood that he had one thing left to do, the hardest thing, the thing he had never in his charmed and cushioned life had to do before. He had to change. Not to speak better, not to court more cleverly, not to overwhelm her doubt with pretty words. He had to become, in fact and over time, in a way she could see and touch and count on, the man he was claiming to be, a man who saw her, valued her, put her happiness above his convenience, chose her freely and daily and openly, in the sight of the whole world, and asked nothing back until she was ready to give it, if she ever was. And she might never be. That was the price, and he knew it, sitting there in the cold grey dawn, that he might do all of this, wholly and truly, for months, for years, and she might never be able to unbend enough to believe it, and he would have to bear that, and go on loving her anyway, without hope of return, because she was worth loving without return, and because he had earned exactly this, and because it was, at long last, the only decent thing. He rose when the sun came up. He rang for his coffee and poured it himself, and carried a cup to the morning room and set it down at Marnie's place before she came down, and went away again without a word. It was a very small thing, But he had never once in his life poured her coffee. In all the years she had poured his, and when she came down and found it there, cooling, at her place, with no note and no explanation and no one to see her find it, she stood over it a long moment with her hand pressed to her breast, and then sat down and drank it, and did not know what to think, and was, though she would not have admitted it, more shaken by that cold cup of coffee than by everything he had said the day before. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Alaric's life, and though he did not know it then, the making of him, he did not court her. That was the first thing he understood, sitting in the dark, and the hardest to hold too. That courtship, in the ordinary sense, the flowers and the compliments and the pressing of his suit, would only prove her right, would only be more of a duke reaching out his hand to take what he wanted. What she needed was not to be wooed. What she needed was to be shown slowly and without reward that he had changed, that the change was real, that it would hold, that it was not a fright or a whim or a jealous fever that would break the moment the colonel was safely disposed of. And a man cannot prove such a thing with words. He can only prove it by living it day upon day, while the one he watches and doubts and waits to be disappointed, and is not disappointed, and slowly, against her own better judgment, begins to hope. So he set himself to it, with the same grim thoroughness he had once set himself to the debts. He learned to see her. That was the beginning. He had looked through her for 20 years. Now he made himself look at her and found, to his shame and wonder, that there was a whole person there he had never met, a woman with tastes and moods and small private habits he had lived beside and never noticed. He learned that she took her tea without sugar, and always had, that she loved the first hard frost and hated the long grey thaw, that she read poetry when she thought no one saw, and hid the book when they did, that she had a way of going quiet and far off in the evenings, and that the far-off place he came slowly to understand was the future she had made her peace with never having, a house of her own, a hearth of her own, a life that was hers and not a borrowed corner of someone else's. He learned that she was lonely, that she had always been lonely, in the particular way of a person who is surrounded and needed and never quite chosen, and that he had done that to her, he above all, by needing her so much and choosing her not at all. And he stopped needing her on purpose, so that he might choose her instead. This was subtle and cost him more than anything. He stopped leaning. He hired a proper steward, a good, plain, careful man, and took the weight of the estate off Marnie's shoulders, where it had sat for a decade, and did the work himself, and let her see him do it, so that she should understand she was no longer indispensable to him as a servant, that he did not want her hands, he wanted her. He stopped handing her his moods to manage. When he was black and low, as he was often that autumn, he took himself off and was low alone, and did not lay it at her feet for her to soothe, because he saw at last what a burden that had always been, how he had used her as a man uses a fire, warming himself and never once wondering whether the fire grew cold. He gave her, in short, her freedom. Deliberately, one strand at a time, cutting the cords by which he had bound her to him, and it was the most frightening thing he had ever done, because with every cord he cut she was freer to leave him, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, because a thing held by cords is not love. And he wanted her love or nothing. She saw it. Of course she saw it. She saw everything. She watched the new steward arrive with astonishment and then with a strange grief, as though a room she had lived in all her life had been taken from her, and Alaric saw the grief and understood it, and act, but held his course. She watched him rise early and pore over the ledgers he had never touched, and correct his own errors, and not once call for her to fix them. She watched him, at the assembly the Marchwoods gave that Christmas, stand up with the plainest and shyest wallflower in the room, a Miss Pole whom no one ever asked, and dance with her the whole of a country dance, and make her laugh and send her back to a mother glowing, not to spite Marnie, not to make her jealous, there was nothing of that in it, but simply because he had become, without her, a kinder man. The sort of man who noticed the overlooked, having been so terribly taught what it was to overlook, and Marnie stood at the side of that ballroom and watched him and pressed her lips together hard, and Alaric, catching sight of her face, thought his heart would crack. For it was the face of a woman who wants desperately to believe a thing and dares not. He did not press her. Through all of it, the autumn, the black Christmas, the long white weeks of the new year, He never once repeated his declaration, never once asked for her answer, never once so much as touched her hand beyond the ordinary courtesies. He was patient the way he had learned to be patient with the land, that gives back nothing for a season and then, if you are full, gives back everything at once. He let her alone. He served her in small, unremarked ways. The coffee poured. The fire built up in the room where she sat before she came to it. The book of poetry he found and had bound for her and left at her place with no note, and asked nothing and waited, and let the days do their slow work. And it was the greatest labor and the greatest love of his life. This doing of nothing, this asking of nothing, this steady, faithful, patient proving of himself in the dark where there was no reward, and slowly, so slowly he hardly dared to mark it, for fear of frightening it away, she began to thaw. It showed first in small things. She stopped watching him warily and began once or twice to watch him with something softer, quickly hidden. She began to seek him out again, of an evening, not to manage him but simply to sit near him, and once he looked up from the ledgers and found her in the doorway watching him work, and neither of them spoke, and she stayed. She began to argue with him again. The old fierce clear arguments about the tenants and the drainage and the world, and he had not known how much he had missed it, how much of her love had always lived in those arguments, and he answered her carefully, and won some and lost more, and never once said sister, and never once needed to say anything else. There came an evening in February, a hard bright frost outside and the fire low, when she read to him for the first time since Marchwood, took up a book without being asked and read to him in the old way, her voice going on quiet in the lamplight while the frost thickened on the panes, and he sat very still and did not look at her, for fear of breaking it, and understood that she was giving him something back, one careful strand at a time, the way he had given her freedom, and that he must not grasp at it, and did not, and let her read, and was that hour so happy and so afraid that he could hardly breathe. He thought, he began to let himself think, that it might after all come right. And then, on a grey morning at the end of that February, the letter came from the north, from the mines at Blackfell, that he had been dreading for a decade and had let himself forget. The great seam had begun to fail, the props were rotten, the water was rising, and 40 families whose whole livelihood depended on that pit were 3 weeks from ruin. And the sum required to shore and drain and save was very nearly the whole of what stood between Penvarra and the depths his father had never truly cleared, only hidden, the debts Marnie had helped him wrestle down for 14 years, and that now, in a single grey letter, rose up out of the past to take everything. There was a night deep in the white heart of that winter, when the thaw between them went further than either had meant it to, and then drew back and taught Alaric the last hard lesson of his long schooling, that he could not hurry her, that the years he had wasted could not be unwasted by a single warm hour, and that the price of his patience was to feel her come near and then watch her go again, and to let her and not to grasp. The snow had come down for 3 days and shut the roads and shut the house, and the two of them were alone in it, but for the servants, alone as they had been alone 1,000 evenings, and yet not as they had ever been alone before, and they had sat late over the fire in the small library, the wind heaping the snow against the panes, and Marnie had read to him, and then had let the book fall closed in her lap, and they had talked, really talked, the old deep easy talk, the talk of two people who have known each other since the beginning of the world, ranging over everything, the tenants and the past and the dead old Duke and the summer of the fever and the fever's grey mare that Marnie still rode, and somewhere in the low fire-lit hours the talk had gone quiet, and they had sat in the quiet, and it had not been the old comfortable quiet but new-charged one, full of everything unsaid, and Alaric had looked at her in the firelight, her face soft and grave, the years and the guardedness gone out of it, and he had wanted so badly to reach across the little distance between their chairs and take her hand that his own hand had actually moved. And she had seen it move, and for a moment, one long trembling moment that he lived over and over afterward, she had not drawn back. She had looked at his hand, half lifted between them, and then up at his face, and her own face had opened and softened, and he had seen in it, plain and unhidden, the girl of 15 who had loved him across a library on the worst night of his life, still there, still loving him, waiting, and his heart had come up into his throat, and he had almost almost spoken, almost reached. Almost gathered up the whole of the last 4 months and the last 20 years and laid it in her lap and said, "Now, Marnie, now at last." And then something had crossed her face, some old weariness, some memory of how much it would cost to be wrong, and she had drawn back, not sharply, not cruelly, but with a small, sad, deliberate gathering in of herself, like a woman stepping back from the edge of a height she has stood on too long to trust, and had risen and said in a voice not quite steady, "It grows late, Alaric, and the fire is nearly out." And she had bid him good night and gone, and at the door she had paused, her hand on the frame, her back to him, and had said low, without turning, "You are very changed. I do see it. I want you to know that I see it." And then, before he could answer, "But I am so afraid still. I have been safe so long. I do not know how to stop being afraid." And she had gone up and left him alone by the dying fire with those words, which were the nearest thing to hope she had given him and the clearest measure of how far there was still to go. He did not follow her. He sat by the cold hearth till dawn. And in the grey morning he understood that his part was not to cure her fear by force, which could not be done, but simply to go on day after day, being the man who would not hurt her, until the sheer accumulated weight of the days should outweigh the fear. That he must be patient not for a week or a month, but for as long as it took, a year, 10 years, forever if it came to that, because the alternative, to press her, to demand her answer, to make her choose before she was ready, would only prove that the old grasping Alaric was still alive under the new one, and would lose him everything. So he set his jaw and went on. He poured her coffee. He built her fire. He gave her room. He let her come near and let her draw back, and never once reproached her for the drawing back. And slept badly and rose, and did it all again, and told himself that a love worth 20 years of her patience was surely worth a little of his, and did not let himself count the cost, and was, in that long, white, patient winter, more nearly a good man than he had ever been in his gilded, careless, blind, unearned life. And Marnie, watching him, for she watched him always now when he did not see, the way he had once failed to watch her, Marnie began, against the whole grain of her hoarded caution, to believe. She would not have said so, she said nothing at all, but she found, as the winter wore toward its hard, bright end, that the fear which had stood like a wall between her and her own heart had begun, quietly and without her leave, to come down one stone at a time, worn away by the plain, relentless evidence of a changed man doing changed things in the dark, where there was nothing to be gained by pretending, and she found herself more and more on the point of speaking, of crossing the little distance, of laying down at last the terrible safe weapon of her own reserve, and each time some old ghost stayed her, and she waited, not knowing for what, not knowing that she was waiting for the one thing that would prove past any doubting that his love was not habit and not jealousy and not remorse, but the true bedrock article, some hour of trial, some cost freely paid, some proof written not in words, but in the hard coin of what a man will actually do and bear and give up for the woman he loves. She did not know she was waiting for Blackfell, but when the grey letter came from the north, and Alaric took it up and rode away into the dark alone, without a word to her, without asking her for anything, she knew, watching his tall figure go down the white avenue in the black cold before dawn, that the waiting was somehow over, and that whatever was coming would settle, one way or the other and forever, the question of the whole of both their lives. He rode north the next morning, in the black cold before dawn, alone. He did not ask her to come. That was the whole difference, and he felt it as he rode, the great aching difference between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The old Alaric would have gone straight to Marnie with the grey letter in his hand, laid it before her, said, "Fix this, help me, sit up with me," and she would have, God bless her, she would have found the money and the men and the plan and the courage, as she always had, and he would have leaned on her and called it love. He did not do it. He took the letter and the crisis and the fear, and he carried them north himself, on his own 2 shoulders, into the freezing dark and the failing pit, because he had told her he had changed, and a man does not prove he has changed by breaking his back at the first hard test. He proved it by carrying the weight alone. Blackfell was worse than the letter. He stood at the pit head in the sleet with the water gaining and the props groaning and 40 grim frightened faces turned to him, and he understood that if the seam went it would take the village with it. and the whole of his fortune in the shoring of it, and that even the whole of his fortune might not be enough, and that he might come home in the spring a duke with a title and a ruin and nothing else. And he found, standing there, that he did not much care about the fortune. He found that the thing he was afraid of was not poverty, but that he would fail these people who depended on him, as he had failed for 20 years the woman who depended on him. And he set his jaw and went down into the pit himself with the engineers, in the dark and the rising water, and worked beside the men day and night for 11 days, and did not spare himself, and got wet through and half frozen and his fine hands torn, and shored the great seam and set the pumps and saved the pit and the village and beggared, very nearly, himself. He wrote to her once from Blackfell, a short plain letter with no appeal in it, telling her only what had happened and what it would cost, and the families were safe. He did not ask her to come. He did not ask her for anything. He signed it, yours Alaric, and looked at the word yours a long time before he sealed it, for it was the truest word in the letter and the one he had no right to. And Marnie came. She came without being asked, on the worst night of it, when the pumps had failed once in the small hours, and it seemed for 6 black terrible hours that all the labour had been for nothing, and the pit would drown after all. She came up the pit road out of the sleet, in the estate's oldest gig with her own 2 hands on the reins, having driven 40 miles through a February night with a bank draft in her bodice that was the whole of her own small savings, 28 years of hoarded quarter days, every penny she had in the world, to throw into the pit that was ruining the man she loved. And Alaric, coming up filthy and grey and beaten from the failed pumps, saw her step down from the gig into the torchlight with the sleet in her dark hair and her chin up and her clear eyes blazing, and stopped dead and could not speak. "You did not ask me," she said. Her voice was fierce and it was shaking. "You went alone. You have never in your life gone alone. And I sat at Penvarra for 11 days, and I thought he is doing it to prove something to me, and I will not be moved by it, I will not." And then the second letter came, that you did not send, from the steward, that told me the truth you left out of yours, that you have gone down into that pit yourself every day, that you have spent very nearly all you have, that you might come home with nothing, and I could not stay away. Do you hear me, Alaric? I could not stay away. That is my answer. I have been trying for 4 months to find some way not to believe you, and I cannot do it any longer, because a man does not carry a thing like this alone, in the dark, asking nothing, for the sake of proving to a woman he loves her. A man does that because it is who he is. And who you are is the man I have loved since I was 15 years old, and I am done pretending I can live without you to keep myself safe, because there is no safety in it. There is only a slow starving, and I would rather ruin with you than reign without you. Here, and she pulled the draft from her bodice, the pitiful, enormous sum of her whole life savings, and pushed it against his chest with both hands, crying now, furious and unashamed, "Take it, it is not much, it is everything I have. Put it in your wretched pit, and let us be poor together. Only stop being so far away." And Alaric Penvarra, 9th Duke of that name, dropped to his knees in the freezing mud of the pit road before the whole astonished crowd of colliers and engineers and gawking village folk, and took her 2 cold hands in his 2 torn filthy ones, and pressed them to his face, and wept, the great feared brooding Duke of Penvarra, on his knees in the mud, weeping it into the hands of his poor cousin, and said, "I do not want your money, Marnie. God forgive me, I have never wanted anything of yours, but the one thing I was too blind for 20 years to see I was starving for. Keep your savings. Buy yourself the poetry you hide. I will save the pit or I will not, and it does not signify, because the only ruin I have ever truly feared is the one I have been living in since Marchwood, which is a life with you in it and no right to your heart. Marry me. Not because I cannot bear to lose you, though I cannot, but because I have spent 4 months learning to deserve you, and I never shall, quite, and I mean to spend the rest of my life failing to, at your side, if you will have me. Marry me, Marnie. I am asking you in the mud with nothing, because it is the only place I have ever been honest. Marry me." And Marnie, weeping, laughing her hands in his ruined hands, looked down at the proudest man in 6 counties kneeling in the muck for love of her, and said, "Yes. Oh, you great fool. Yes. It always was yes. It was yes when I was 15. Get up out of the mud, Alaric, you will catch your death. and I have not waited 20 years to nurse you into an early grave. Get up, get up. And he got up. And there in the sleet and the torchlight before the whole cheering crowd he took her in his arms at last, and held her as though he had been drowning and she were the shore, and she pressed her face into his filthy coat, and held him back with all her strength, and the colliers roared. And somewhere someone was ringing the pit bell for no reason but joy, and the two of them stood in the middle of it holding on and not letting go. The pumps caught again an hour later. The pit was saved. It cost him in the end a great deal, but not everything. And what it cost he never once regretted, and what he had left, he thought afterward, was worth 10 times what he had lost, for he had gone north a rich, lonely man and come home poorer and richer than he had ever been in his life. They came home from Blackfell together, in the same gig she had driven north in, with the grey mare hitched behind, and the whole grim, exhausted business of the pit behind them, and the whole of the rest of their lives before. And the drive back through the softening February country was the sweetest journey of Alaric's life, though nothing happened in it at all but that they were together, and betrothed, and there was no more pretending. They said very little on the road. There was, after 20 years and 4 months, remarkably little that needed saying, and both of them knew it, and were content to sit close under the one rug with the mare's soft footfalls behind, and the thaw dripping from the hedges, and now and then Marnie would lay her head against his shoulder, and now and then he would take his hand from the reins to cover her 2 cold hands with his one, and that was all, and it was everything. Once she said, out of a long comfortable silence, "You went alone. I shall never quite forgive you for going alone." And he said, "I had to. Can you see now why I had to?" And she was quiet a moment, and then said, "Yes, I can see it. It is the only thing you could have done that would have made me believe you. If you had come to me with the letter and asked me to help you carry it, I should have helped you and I should have loved you, and I should never have been sure that it was me you wanted and not my strong back. You had to take the weight away from me before I could believe you did not only want me for it." And he said, "I know, that is why I did it." And she turned her face up to him, wondering, and said, "When did you grow so wise?" And he said, "The day I nearly lost you, and every day since, learning. I am the slowest scholar in England, Marnie, but I do learn in the end if I am beaten hard enough." And she laughed, that low, warm laugh he had thought at Marchwood he had lost forever, and put her head back on his shoulder, and they came home. The betrothal was the talk of 6 counties, and not, at first, kindly. That the Duke of Penvarra, the great prize, the unattainable, the man who had refused earls' daughters, should at last be caught. And caught not by any of the reigning beauties who had hunted him for 15 years, but by his own poor cousin, the plain useful woman who had kept his house, the nobody, the charity child grown gaunt in his service. It was a scandal, a folly, a betrayal of the whole ambitious sisterhood of the North, and it was said, in a great many drawing-rooms, that the Duke had run mad, that the woman had schemed for it these 20 years, that it was a shocking waste and a shocking match and a 9 days' wonder that would end in his regret. Alaric heard all of it, for such things are always faithfully carried back to their subjects, and he found that it did not touch him in the least, that where once the good opinion of the county had been the very air he breathed, now he did not care a straw for it, and would have married Marnie Vane in the sight of the whole sneering world, and counted every sneer a small price gladly paid. He did more than not care. He set himself, deliberately and with a cold ducal pleasure, to make the county eat its words. He took Marnie everywhere, on his arm, openly, proudly, to every assembly and dinner and card party in the district, and he stood at her side, and he watched the same mothers who had hunted him for 15 years be obliged to curtsy to the woman they had despised. And he saw Marnie carry it all with a straight back and a level eye and a quiet dignity that shamed every fine lady in the room, and he was prouder of her than he had ever been of anything in his life. The talk turned as talk does. Within a season it was being said that the Duke had shown great good sense, that Miss Vane had always been a superior sort of woman, that it was a love match and how romantic, that they had known of it all along. And Alaric received the world's late approval with exactly the contempt it deserved and exactly the courtesy it required, and privately he and Marnie laughed at it together by their own fire, which was the best revenge of all. There was one call he made in that betrothed spring that he never spoke of afterward. He rode over to Hertsmere alone and sat an hour with Colonel Hartley in the manner the colonel was setting so lovingly to rights. And the two men drank the colonel's wine and spoke of the land and the season and everything but the one thing, until at the last, rising to go, Alaric had stopped and turned and said plainly, "I came to thank you. I have wanted to since Marchwood and never found the words. You saw her, Hartley. You saw her in a single night, whole and clear, what she was worth, and it woke me. I should have slept my whole life and lost her, but for you, and you gave her up. You had every right to fight for her, and she might, I do not deceive myself, she might in time have chosen you, and made you a good and happy man, and you saw that, and you stepped back, because you saw she was already given, and you would not take her against her heart. I do not know that I could have done it. I do not think I could. It was the act of a better man than I am, and I shall be in your debt to the end of my days, and I do not know how to bear it except to say, come to the wedding, stand up with me. Let the whole county see the two of us friends, so that no one shall ever whisper against her that there was rivalry or shame in it. Will you?" And the colonel had been silent a while, and then had put out his hand, and Alaric had taken it, and the colonel had said gruffly, "I'll come, and I'll dance at it, by God, and drink your health, and mean it. She chose right, Penvarra. She was always going to choose right. It was only ever a question of whether you'd give her the chance. You gave it. That's all a man could do. Now go home to her, and God bless you both. And pour her wine yourself, Nan. A woman likes to be waited on by the man who loves her, whatever she says." And Alaric had ridden home through the spring dusk lighter in his heart than he had ever been, and had gone straight in and found Marnie and poured her wine himself, and never told her why, though she looked at him oddly, and she never knew, until she was old, of the hour he had spent at Hertsmere, and when she learned it at last she wept, and said it was the finest thing she had ever heard of two men doing, and Alaric said no. The finest thing was the letter the colonel wrote back, and would not tell her what was in it, and never did. So the winter of doubt gave way to the spring of certainty, and the great house of Penvarra, which had run for 20 years on the unthanked labour of a hidden heart, made ready at last to crown that heart openly, and to become, after 2 centuries of dukes and their bargained duchesses, the scene of a thing it had never once witnessed within its grey walls, a marriage made not of land or blood or ambition, but purely, foolishly, gloriously, of love. Love long overlooked and late awakened and hard won and freely given, the rarest and the truest and the most unlooked-for thing in all the ordered ambitious world of the Duke of Penvarra, and the only thing in the end he had ever truly needed, and the only thing he had very nearly, through his own long blindness, let slip forever through his careless open hands. They were married on a morning in late April, when the whole valley of Penvarra had come green, and the May was white in the hedges, and the trout stream, that same trout stream, over which Alaric had once so disastrously rhymed her eyes, ran full and bright below the church. The small grey church of Penvarra had married every duke of that name for 200 years, and had seen, within its cool stone walls, a good many stately weddings and cold ones, matches of land to land, and name to name, and fortune to convenient fortune, brides given like counters across a board. But it had never in 2 centuries seen a wedding quite like this one, and the parish talked of it for a generation after, and the oldest of them talked of it still on their deathbeds, for it was the one they had all agreed was the happiest thing that ever befell the great house on the hill. There was a difference in it that the whole crowded church remarked, and it was this: the bride came up the aisle not on the arm of any borrowed relation, not given away by any man as a thing is given from one keeping to another, but alone, upright, unhurried, in a gown of soft dove-grey silk that Alaric had begged her to make white and gold, and she had refused, saying she was 28 and would not play the blushing girl, and would wear what became a woman who knew her own mind, and had never in her life looked so beautiful as she looked that morning coming up the aisle in her plain grey silk with her head high, and her clear eyes fixed steady on the man at the altar. She had asked to walk alone, and Alaric had understood why, and had granted it. Because she had come to Penvarra alone, a fatherless charity infant with no one in the world to give her, and she would come to her marriage, as she had come to everything in her life, on her own 2 feet, owing the walk to no one, and the whole church, watching her come, understood it too. And there was not a dry eye among the tenants who knew her and loved her, and had waited longer than she knew for someone to see her worth. And Alaric did the thing no bridegroom in the county had ever done, the thing they told their grandchildren of. He did not stand at the altar and wait for her to be brought to him. He came down from the altar, went down the aisle to meet her, in the sight of the whole astonished congregation, breaking every rule of how such things were done, and met her halfway, did not take her arm to lead her, but offered his own, and let her take it, so that they walked the last of the aisle side by side, level, neither leading and neither led, and came to the altar together, having chosen each other and come to it each of their own free will. And the old parson, who had christened them both, faltered a moment over his book, unmanned, and had to begin again. And somewhere behind them a woman was weeping frankly, and it was the widow Cray, whose boundary hedge the Duke had settled. And Colonel Hartley stood up straight and soldierly in his pew with his jaw set hard and his eyes bright. And when the vows were spoken, Alaric's low and rough and unhesitating, Marnie's clear and steady and full, the colonel was the first, before the words were fairly out, to say amen, so loud it startled the church, and then to be terribly embarrassed, and to blow his nose like a trumpet, being, as Alaric had always said, a soldier and hopelessly sentimental. They came out of the church into the white and green and gold of the April morning, man and wife, and the tenants of Penvarra, 300 of them and more, lined the whole road from the church door to the great house and cheered them the whole way, through May blossom and early flowers, wept and laughed and called down blessings on the pair of them, on the Duke who had learned at last to see, and on the woman they had all seen clearly for years and been powerless to help, now crowned before them all as the mistress of Penvarra, walking up the road to her own home on the arm of the man she had loved in silence for 13 years, and Marnie, who had schooled her face for 28 years to show nothing, walked up that road with the tears running down it openly and unashamedly, and did not care who saw. And Alaric, her side, his hand over her hand where it lay in the crook of his arm, felt her tremble, and bent his dark head to her and said, "Lo, only for her, you are home, Marnie. You were always home. I only took a shameful long while to bring you in from the cold." And she laughed and wept and pressed his arm and could not answer. The wedding feast was held in the great hall of Penvarra, the hall Marnie had run for 20 years and never once sat at the head of, and Alaric had given orders, his own orders, that he had troubled to give himself, having learned at last what the giving of them cost, that on this one day she should lift not a finger, should command nothing and arrange nothing and manage nothing, but should sit at the head of the table in her grey silk and be waited on, be served, be cherished. And he himself, the Duke of Penvarra, in the sight of his whole household and half the county, filled her glass with his own hand, and set the first and best of every dish before her before he took any himself, and served her through the whole long feast as a man serves the thing he holds most precious in the world. And the servants who had watched her wait on him for 20 years watched him wait on her now, and understood the whole story in it, and loved him for it. And the old butler who had known Alaric since he was a boy in petticoats had to leave the hall twice to compose himself. Colonel Hartley danced at the wedding, as he had promised, and danced first with the bride, by Alaric's own insistence, and led her out with a grave courtly grace, and turned her down the room and gave her back to her husband at the end with a bow, and a word neither of them ever repeated. And then he drank the Duke's health, standing before the whole company, and made a soldier's plain short speech, that the half of them weeping again, in which he said only that he had come home from the wars looking for peace, and had found in one autumn the 2 finest people in England, and that he counted the losing of his own suit the greatest good fortune of his life, for it had gained him 2 such friends, and that any man who could not be happy for a happiness so plainly deserved was no man at all. And he sat down to such a roar of approval that he went scarlet and had to be plied with wine. He went home to Hertsmere that night the loneliest happy man in the north, and within the year, as has been told, married a warm-hearted widow of his own parish and grew old, and content among his own fields with his own children about his knee. And he and the Duke of Penvarra were the fastest of friends to the end of their long lives, and dined together every month for 30 years. and each said privately that he owed the other everything, and each of them was entirely right. And the years that came after were the good long ordinary years, the years no chronicle records because nothing happens in them but happiness, and they were the truest wealth of Alaric's life, richer by far than the title and the acres and the saved mine and all the rest of it. There were children in time, and Penvarra rang with them, and Marnie, who had been an unwanted charity infant, raised her own well-loved ones in the house that had grudged her a corner, and was the gentlest and the wisest and the most present mother in the county, having known to the marrow what it was to be a child no one quite chose. And Alaric grew old at her side and softened, and the 6 counties that had feared him came in the end to speak of him with a rough affection they had never dreamed of. The good Duke, they called him, which would have made the young Alaric stare, and he owed it all, every good thing he ever did or became, to a single evening's firelight at Marchwood, and to the fair honest soldier who had looked at his cousin across a ballroom and seen what her own guardian had been too blind for 20 years to see. He never called her sister again. Not once, in 40 years, did that word cross his lips. He called her his wife and his heart and his own true north, and most often, in the long contented evenings by their own hearth, with the frost thick on the panes in winter and the May white at the window in spring, and a book of poetry open on her knee that she no longer troubled to hide. Most often he called her simply Marnie, in a voice he had never once used in the first 36 blind years of his life, the low, wondering, grateful voice of a man who has been given, past all his deserving, the one thing he never knew how to want until he had all but lost it. He had looked straight through her for 20 years. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for 40 more, and never once, to his very last day, got over the plain daily astonishment of her, and never once again, in all those years, let a single morning pass without rising, and pouring her coffee with his own hand, and setting it at her place before she came down, and staying to watch her face when she found it there, the way she had watched so long ago, over that first cold cup he had left her the morning after he learned what he had thrown away. He knew at last precisely what he had and precisely what it was worth, and precisely how near he had come to losing it forever through his own carelessness. And he had loved her, he understood now, all along, every day of both their lives, from the very beginning. Only he had been too long a boy to know the name of it, and having learned it late and dearly, and very nearly too late of all, he spent the whole long remainder of his days making certain that Marguerite Vane, once the most overlooked woman in the north of England, should never for one single hour of the rest of her life be overlooked again.